In this lesson, we're going to look at how resources move through ecosystems. As a review, remember in photosynthesis, the reactants are carbon dioxide and water, and the products are glucose, which is the primary product, and oxygen, which is a waste product. All organisms need energy, materials, and space in order to survive. And the way that they get these is called their niche. It's also essentially their role within the ecosystem. First, let's look at how energy is cycled in ecosystems. So all the energy in an ecosystem comes from the sun originally, and then that energy is transferred from one organism to another. And remember that we can't create or destroy energy, we're simply transforming it from one form to another and transferring it from one organism to another. So there's two types of organisms in terms of how they get energy. We have autotrophs, which make food through photosynthesis. And auto means self and troph means feeding, so they're self-feeding individuals. And they're really important because they are how energy actually enters the ecosystem. Then we have heterotrophs, which have to eat another organism in order to get energy. And hetero means different, so they feed on something different. Now, there are a number of types of heterotrophs based on what they eat. So we have herbivores that eat autotrophs, kind of like cows eat grass. Carnivores eat other heterotrophs. Omnivores eat both, so for example, human beings. And decomposers are those that break down dead organisms. Now, as energy is transferred from one organism to another as the organism eats it, very little is actually transferred. So just because you eat an organism that has a bunch of energy in it doesn't mean that all that energy gets transferred to you. In fact, most of it is lost as heat or is used by that organism prior to you eating it. So here we have a diagram that shows how energy moves through an ecosystem. So autotrophs take the energy from the sun through the process of photosynthesis. That's how it enters the ecosystem. Then various heterotrophs eat autotrophs and other heterotrophs and transfer that energy along. And then finally, whether you're an autotroph or a heterotroph, when you die, decomposers will release that energy back out into the ecosystem. At every one of these stages, heat is being generated, and so that energy is being lost, as well as all of these organisms are doing cellular respiration, meaning that they are using some of that energy. So, sort of illustrate this, I'm going to show an example with a water bucket. So person number one is going to fill up this bucket with water. Person number one is the only one that actually can use the faucet or whatever, and so they are an autotroph. Similar to how an autotroph is the only one that can actually take the energy from the sun. So this filling the water bucket represents photosynthesis, and the water represents energy. So this person has a whole bunch of energy. Now, because they need energy to survive, they're going to use a little bit of it. Then person number two, so this is through cellular respiration, and person number two is going to come along and take that bucket from them. So person number two represents an herbivore. So they have transferred this energy because the herbivore ate the autotroph. Now person number two also has to do cellular respiration, and they're going to use a little bit of the water. And then person number three takes it. This would be our carnivore. And they use a little bit of it. And then person number four takes it, and then they use a little bit of it. And now you can see we don't have any more energy left. So the energy can only be transferred so many times through an ecosystem before you just run out of energy. And there can't be a person number 5 because there's no energy to support them. Each one of these steps is a trophic level. So every time energy is transferred, that's called a trophic level or feeding level. As you go up in trophic level, so as you go up in a food chain, there's going to be less energy available and a fewer number of organisms. So for example, in this food chain, there's going to be a whole lot more plants than there are eagles, because there's less energy available at the top of the food chain than there is at the bottom. So in our example, each time that bucket was passed off, that would have been a trophic level, and we went from a lot of energy to no energy as we went up in trophic levels. If we look at this in an ecosystem, these blocks represent how many of a certain organism there are. So there's a whole lot of producers. And then as we go up through herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores, so our consumers, there gets less and less energy available, so there are fewer and fewer individuals. And just remember the differences between food chains and food webs. Now let's switch over to how materials are cycled through the carbon and nitrogen cycles. So the carbon cycle involves the element carbon, and it naturally is occurring in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, which plants are going to take in through photosynthesis. And then animals and decomposers, once they eat the plants and get it, are going to release it back out through cellular respiration. So when we look at a diagram of this, like I said, we have CO2 in the air. Photosynthesis captures that CO2 and converts it into glucose. Organisms then, using respiration, will release it back out into the atmosphere. And decomposers will put it into the soil. Additionally, humans have a big impact on the carbon cycle through the burning of fossil fuels, which releases a lot of CO2, and deforestation, both of which can lead to global warming, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So here we have human beings putting a lot of carbon into the atmosphere that had been stored underground as fossil fuels, and when we cut down trees, they aren't doing as much photosynthesis then, and so CO2 can build up more in the atmosphere. Additionally, natural processes like volcanoes release a lot of carbon dioxide. The ocean actually holds a lot of carbon dioxide, which is why it's called a carbon sink. But this has a lot of issues as well, and we'll talk about those again a little bit later. Now, switching to the nitrogen cycle, the most important thing to remember in this is nitrogen-fixing bacteria. These bacteria take nitrogen that's in the air, of which the majority of the air on Earth is nitrogen, and they turn it into nitrogen that plants can actually use in the soil. So they are super important. Now, other bacteria and decomposers are then going to release this back out into the air. So when we look at this diagram, N2 is nitrogen in the air. Plants can't use this, but these bacteria are able to convert that into a form that can then be taken in by plants and then gotten by animals when they eat those plants. The decomposers put it into the soil, and then different bacteria will release it back out into the atmosphere.